What was the most sexist rule at your school? Our principal, Mrs. Garrett, made girls submit photos of our outfits every morning through an app before we could enter the building. If she deemed anything distracting to male students, we'd get sent to the nurse's office to change into oversized gray sweatsuits that said, "Dress code violation," in red letters across the front and back. Shoulders showing? Violation? Shorts above fingertip length? Violation? Leggings without a skirt? Violation. She'd patrol hallways with a ruler, measuring skirt lengths and tank top straps. 3 violations meant suspension and a note on your college applications. Meanwhile, boys wore muscle shirts with armholes cut down to their waists, and nobody said anything. My friend Maya got sent home for wearing the same polo shirt the boys' soccer team wore because it fit her differently. Another girl lost her National Honor Society position because her growth spurt made her uniform skirt inappropriately short, even though she couldn't afford a new one. We started carrying backup clothes, checking each other in bathrooms, warning about Mrs. Garrett's location through group texts. I'd gone 2 years without a violation by wearing baggy hoodies even in 90-degree weather. I kept my diabetic supplies in my backpack and had perfected changing my insulin pump tubing through my clothes so I'd never have to lift my shirt. My mom worked as an EMT on 12-hour shifts, so if I got sent home, I'd be alone until midnight. Everything changed the week before SATs. My insulin pump malfunctioned during second period. The tube got kinked and wasn't delivering insulin. My blood sugar was already at 380 and climbing fast. At 400, I'd risk diabetic ketoacidosis. At 500, I could slip into a coma. I needed to change the infusion site immediately, which meant lifting my shirt to access my stomach where the pump connected. I rushed to the bathroom, but it was being cleaned. The nurse's office had a line of dress code violators waiting for their shame sweatsuits. The disabled bathroom was locked. My vision was starting to blur, a bad sign. Hands shaking, head pounding, I ducked into an empty science lab. I had my shirt lifted, frantically trying to disconnect the bad tubing and insert a new infusion set when Mrs. Garrett walked in with a tour group of school board members. She saw my exposed stomach with the medical device attached and her face lit up like she'd won the lottery. "This is exactly the behavior I've been talking about," she announced to the board members. "Girls thinking they can expose themselves whenever they want. It's medical," I tried to explain, fumbling to reconnect my pump. "Cover yourself immediately." She pulled out her phone, taking photos. "This is beyond inappropriate. You're traumatizing these visitors." My blood sugar monitor screamed in alarm. 425. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the new infusion set connected. Sweat poured down my face. One of the board members, an older woman, stepped forward. "Is that an insulin pump?" "It's a manipulation tactic," Mrs. Garrett said quickly. "They'll claim anything to avoid consequences." "Mrs. Garrett, I'm going into DKA," I managed to say. "I need to change my pump site now, or..." "You can explain your excuses in suspension. Office. Now." I stood up, swaying. The room tilted. My monitor shrieked again. 450. Without insulin, every minute meant more damage to my organs. But I walked to her office, sat in the chair, and watched her fill out paperwork while my body destroyed itself from the inside. She took 20 minutes typing up my violation, adding indecent exposure and defiance of authority to the form. My pump alarm went off 3 more times. I told her I needed medical attention. She said I should have thought about that before breaking dress code. When I stood to leave for the nurse, she blocked the door. "Sit down or I'll add assault to your record." By the time she released me, my blood sugar was 510. The nurse called 911. I spent 3 days in the ICU. The doctor said another 30 minutes and I might have slipped into a coma. While I was unconscious, Mrs. Garrett emailed all parents with photos of me, exposing myself, claiming my medical emergency was fake. But one of those board members was Dr. Pamela Salos, chief of pediatric endocrinology at Children's Hospital. She knew exactly what she'd witnessed. Mrs. Garrett was fired immediately. But when we searched her office computer, we found a folder labeled Problem Girls. Inside were photos of 17 students in medical distress. And that's not even the worst part. I woke up 3 days later with tubes in both arms and machines beeping all around me. The hospital room was bright and cold, and every part of my body felt heavy and wrong. Mom was asleep in the chair next to my bed, still wearing her blue EMT uniform from her shift. Her face looked puffy and red, and I could see dried tears on her cheeks. My throat hurt and my mouth tasted like metal. I tried to sit up, but the tubes pulled and a sharp pain shot through my arm. The movement made one of the machines beep louder and Mom jerked awake. A doctor came in a few minutes later. A tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She checked the monitors and wrote something on a clipboard, then pulled up a stool next to my bed. She explained I'd had something called diabetic ketoacidosis, which meant my blood sugar got so high that my blood turned acidic and started destroying my organs from the inside. The ambulance got there just in time because my kidneys were starting to fail and my brain was swelling. Another 30 minutes without insulin and I would have gone into a coma. She said it might have caused permanent brain damage or I could have died. Mom started crying again when the doctor said that, pressing her hands over her face. The doctor squeezed Mom's shoulder and left us alone. Mom moved to the edge of my bed and grabbed my hand, apologizing over and over. She said she was sorry for not being there. for working so many shifts, for not somehow knowing this would happen and stopping it. I told her it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known Mrs. Garrett would trap me in her office while my blood sugar climbed. But I could see the guilt eating at her, the way her face crumpled every time she looked at the tubes in my arms. A woman with a hospital badge that said social services came in that afternoon. She had a kind face and a notebook, and she sat in the chair Mom had been sleeping in. She asked what happened and why I waited so long to change my pump site when I knew my blood sugar was dangerous. I explained about the bathroom being cleaned, the nurse's office full of dress code violators, the disabled bathroom locked. I told her about ducking into the science lab because my vision was blurring and I was running out of time. Then I described Mrs. Garrett walking in with the school board members, taking photos, refusing to let me explain about the medical device. The social worker's face changed while I talked, going from concerned to angry. She wrote faster in her notebook, underlining things. When I got to the part about Mrs. Garrett keeping me in her office for 20 minutes while my pump alarm went off 3 times, the social worker stopped writing and just stared at me. She asked if Mrs. Garrett knew I needed medical help, and I said yes. I told her multiple times I was going into DKA. The social worker closed her notebook and said she'd be filing a report about what happened. Later that afternoon, Dr. Salos came to visit. She introduced herself as the board member who was on the tour that day, the one who asked about my insulin pump. She pulled up the same stool the doctor used and told me she'd already reported everything she witnessed to the superintendent and the school board. Mrs. Garrett had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Dr. Salos said she knew exactly what was happening when she saw my pump and heard the alarm, and she was horrified that Mrs. Garrett refused to let me get help. She promised she would do everything she could to make sure Mrs. Garrett faced consequences for what she did. Then Dr. Salos pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my stomach hurt worse than the tubes. While I was unconscious, Mrs. Garrett had sent an email to every parent in the school with photos of me in the science lab. The email called it indecent exposure and said my medical emergency was fake, just an excuse to break dress code. I could see my own face in the photo, sweaty and pale, my shirt lifted to show the pump site. Seeing it like that turned into evidence of me doing something wrong, made me feel sick and violated all over again. Dr. Salos put her phone away and explained that she was the chief of pediatric endocrinology at Children's Hospital. She recognized immediately what was happening to me and understood that Mrs. Garrett's interference was medical neglect. She said she was prepared to testify about how serious my condition was and how the delay could have killed me. Her voice was calm but firm, and I believed her when she said she'd fight to make sure this never happened to another student. The hospital kept me for 2 more days to stabilize my blood sugar and make sure my organs weren't permanently damaged. I spent most of the time sleeping, but when I was awake, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I came to dying, all because I needed to change my insulin pump and Mrs. Garrett decided dress code rules mattered more than my life. Sometimes I'd wake up crying without knowing why, and the nurses would come check on me and adjust my medications. Mom stayed with me the whole time, sleeping in that uncomfortable chair and eating cafeteria food. Maya came to visit on the 2nd day, carrying a big bunch of flowers from the grocery store. The second she saw me in the hospital bed with all the tubes, she started crying. She sat in the chair and cried so hard she couldn't talk for a few minutes. When she finally calmed down, she told me she'd felt guilty for 2 years about the polo shirt thing. She said she should have fought back harder, or reported Mrs. Garrett to someone instead of just accepting the punishment. I told her it wasn't her fault either, that Mrs. Garrett made all of us feel like we deserved it. More friends came to visit over the next day, and each one had a story about dress code violations. Sarah told me about getting sent home because her bra strap showed through her shirt. Jessica said Mrs. Garrett made her stand in front of the class while she measured her shorts with a ruler. Amanda described being pulled out of a test because her tank top straps were too thin. As I listened to them, I realized how many of us had these stories. We'd all spent years thinking we were alone, each of us coming up with our own strategies to survive Mrs. Garrett's rules. We carried backup clothes, warned each other through group texts, wore baggy hoodies in 90-degree heat. We'd been fighting the same battle individually instead of recognizing the pattern of what was really happening to us. Mom used her saved vacation days to take a week off work and stay home with me after the hospital released me. She didn't talk much about what happened, just made sure I had my insulin supplies organized and my blood sugar monitor charged and food ready whenever I needed it. She sat in the living room while I rested in my bedroom, close enough that I could call for her if something went wrong with my pump again. Having her there made me feel safer than I had in years, even though we both knew she couldn't afford to miss the shifts and our bank account would suffer for it. She checked on me every few hours, bringing water and asking about my numbers, and I stopped feeling like I had to handle everything alone. The school superintendent Blake called on the 4th day of my recovery. Mom answered and put it on speaker so I could hear. His voice sounded uncomfortable and careful, like he was reading from a script someone wrote for him. He wanted to schedule a meeting about my return to the school and kept using phrases like the incident and ensuring student safety moving forward, without actually saying what Mrs. Garrett did to me. Mom told him we'd call back when I felt strong enough to discuss it, and he agreed quickly, probably relieved to end the conversation. 2 days later, Dr. Salos called with news that made my chest feel tight. Mrs. Garrett had been fired effective immediately, not just placed on leave like we thought. The school board held an emergency meeting after reviewing Dr. Salos's witness statement and my medical records from the ICU. They voted unanimously for termination, which meant Mrs. Garrett couldn't claim it was a misunderstanding or appeal the decision. Dr. Salos explained that my case showed clear medical neglect, and the board couldn't ignore a pediatric specialist's testimony about how close I came to dying. Hearing about the firing gave me this weird mix of relief and anger. Relief because Mrs. Garrett couldn't hurt anyone else, but anger because it took me nearly dying for anyone to take the dress code enforcement seriously. How many other students suffered through violations and humiliation, and nobody cared because they didn't happen to have a doctor watching? How many girls spent years thinking they deserved punishment for having bodies that existed in teenage form? The relief felt good, but the anger burned hotter, making me wonder what would have happened if Dr. Salos hadn't been on that tour, if I'd slipped into a coma with nobody to explain what Mrs. Garrett had done. 3 days after Dr. Salos's call, Blake contacted Mom again with information that changed everything. The IT specialist clearing out Mrs. Garrett's office computer found a folder labeled Problem Girls buried in her files. Inside were photos and detailed notes about 17 students Mrs. Garrett considered troublemakers for dress code violations. The specialist immediately alerted Blake, who called an emergency meeting with all the parents whose daughters were named in the folder. Mom and I drove to the district office on a Tuesday evening and found the conference room packed with 16 other families, all looking confused and worried about why they'd been summoned. Blake stood at the front with a laptop, his face pale and serious. Parents filled every chair and lined the walls, their voices rising in questions and demands for answers about what was happening. Blake opened the laptop and started explaining what the IT specialist found. The folder contained photos Mrs. Garrett took of students throughout the past 3 years. Some showed girls crying in the violation sweatsuits, their faces red and tear-streaked while wearing those horrible gray outfits with the red letters. Others were close-up shots documenting body types with notes about problem areas and attention-seeking behavior, typed underneath. Mrs. Garrett had written detailed observations about chest sizes, hip measurements, how certain girls displayed themselves in standard school uniforms. The documentation was obsessive and disturbing, like she'd been studying us as specimens instead of students. Blake clicked through the photos on the projector screen and parents started gasping and crying. One mother in the front row suddenly stood up and pointed at the screen. She recognized her daughter Kiana in a photo from 2 years ago, and she started sobbing so hard she couldn't speak. Her husband put his arm around her while she cried. Kiana had told them the uniform skirt was too short because of a growth spurt, and they'd been saving money to buy a new one, but Mrs. Garrett suspended her before they could afford it. The mother kept saying she didn't know. She didn't understand how bad it was. She thought Kiana was exaggerating about the principal's treatment. Blake promised a full investigation into how Mrs. Garrett operated without oversight for so long. He offered to connect families with counseling services and said the district would cover the costs. He looked genuinely shaken by what the folder revealed, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the laptop. But several parents were already talking about lawyers and lawsuits, their voices angry and loud in the conference room. They wanted to know who else knew about Mrs. Garrett's behavior, why nobody stopped her sooner, what the district planned to do beyond just firing her. Blake kept trying to calm everyone down, but the anger in the room was too strong. Then Blake opened the folder again and clicked to Maya's photo. My stomach dropped seeing her face on that screen in front of everyone. The notes underneath called her defiant and masculine presenting for wearing the soccer team polo shirt. Mrs. Garrett had written detailed observations about how Maya dressed, how she walked, how she talked to other students. The notes revealed that Mrs. Garrett specifically targeted Maya not just for dress code violations, but for gender expression, for not fitting into Mrs. Garrett's narrow idea of how girls should look and act. Maya's parents sat 3 rows behind us, and I heard her father swear under his breath. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, 17 families knew their daughters had been documented, photographed, and targeted by a principal who treated teenage bodies like problems to be solved. I walked out of that conference room with Mom's hand on my shoulder, but I couldn't feel it. The parking lot lights made everything look washed out and fake. We drove home in silence, and I stared out the window thinking about 17 girls. 17 separate stories of being measured and photographed and shamed. 17 files documenting how we dressed and moved and existed in our bodies. Mom pulled into our driveway and turned off the car, but neither of us moved. She finally said she was sorry, and I told her it wasn't her fault. We sat there for 10 more minutes before going inside. I went straight to my room and lay on my bed fully clothed. My pump beeped its normal alerts, and each sound made my chest tight. I kept seeing that folder on the projector screen. All those photos Mrs. Garrett took like we were specimens in some twisted science experiment. 3 years of documentation. How many other girls were there before she started keeping digital records? How many victims graduated without knowing others went through the same thing? 2 days later, Mom's phone rang during breakfast. A woman named Natalia Ross introduced herself as a civil rights attorney. She'd heard about the folder from another parent at the meeting. She specialized in cases involving discrimination and believed we had grounds for a lawsuit, not just against Mrs. Garrett personally, but against the school district for letting her operate without oversight for so long. Mom put the phone on speaker, and Natalia explained she wanted to represent all 17 families collectively. Strength in numbers, she said. She'd already spoken to 6 other families and they were interested. She gave Mom her office address downtown and suggested we come in for a consultation. No charge for the initial meeting. Mom scheduled an appointment for Friday afternoon. Natalia's office was on the 3rd floor of an old building near the courthouse. The waiting room had worn chairs and stacks of legal magazines. Natalia came out to greet us wearing jeans and a blazer. She looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s. She led us back to her office and pulled out a folder much thicker than I anticipated. She'd already started building the case. The photos Mrs. Garrett took without our consent could violate privacy laws. The folder itself constituted evidence of discriminatory enforcement since it only documented girls, never boys. The body-shaming notes Mrs. Garrett wrote could support claims of sexual harassment. Natalia spread papers across her desk showing the dress code policy, incident reports, and emails Mrs. Garrett sent to parents. She explained that my medical emergency gave us the strongest case because Mrs. Garrett deliberately prevented me from accessing life-saving care. That crossed from policy enforcement into potential criminal territory. The other 16 cases showed a pattern of targeting that no school district could defend. Natalia talked for 40 minutes about depositions and discovery and settlement negotiations. Mom asked questions about timeline and costs. Natalia said most civil rights cases take a year minimum, but she'd work on contingency. We only paid if we won. Mom and I looked at each other. I nodded. Mom told Natalia we were in. That night, I dreamed I was back in Mrs. Garrett's office. My blood sugar climbing past 400, and she just kept typing. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't move. I tried to yell, but no sound came out. My pump alarm screamed, and Mrs. Garrett smiled. I woke up at 3 a.m. soaked in sweat. I grabbed my pump off the nightstand and checked the display. Blood sugar normal. Insulin flowing correctly. I disconnected the tubing anyway and examined every inch of it under my desk lamp. No kinks, no blockages, everything working fine. I reconnected it and checked my blood sugar again. Still normal. I lay back down but couldn't sleep. I got up and checked the pump again at 3:45, then 4:20, then 5:10. Mom found me at 5:30 sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by spare pump supplies. She didn't say anything, just sat down next to me. We stayed there until sunrise. The school counselor Dinesh called that afternoon. He'd been assigned to schedule appointments with all 17 girls from the folder. His voice was gentle on the phone, not pushy. He said he understood if I wasn't ready to talk, but his door was open whenever I wanted. Mom made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I went reluctantly, expecting the usual adult platitudes about everything happening for a reason. Dinesh's office was small, with a couch and chairs and a window overlooking the parking lot. He didn't start with questions about my feelings. He said what Mrs. Garrett did was institutional abuse. He used those exact words. Not bullying, not strict enforcement, not a misunderstanding. Abuse. He said the school failed us by not providing oversight. He said we had every right to be angry and scared and traumatized. He didn't try to make me feel better or tell me to move on. He just validated that what happened was wrong. I cried for the first time since waking up in the hospital. Not sad crying, angry crying. All the rage I'd been holding in for 2 years of baggy hoodies and constant vigilance came pouring out. Dinesh handed me tissues and waited. When I finally stopped, he asked if I wanted to come back next week. I said yes. Returning to the school felt impossible. I'd been out for 2 weeks since the ICU. My teachers sent homework through email, but I was falling behind in 3 classes. Staying home meant failing senior year. Mom offered to drive me the first day back. I got dressed that morning and changed outfits 4 times. Nothing felt safe even though Mrs. Garrett was gone. We pulled into the school parking lot 20 minutes before first period. Mom turned off the engine. I stared at the building entrance. Students walked past our car heading inside. I counted to 10 and told myself to open the door. I couldn't move. Mom didn't push. She just sat there with me. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Finally, at 5 minutes before first bell, I grabbed my backpack and opened the door. Mom squeezed my hand. I walked across the parking lot feeling like everyone was watching me even though most students weren't paying attention. The hallways felt different. I couldn't explain exactly how, but something had shifted. Maya found me at my locker and hugged me without saying anything. Some students smiled at me in that sympathetic way that made me feel like a victim. Others whispered when I walked past. I heard fragments of conversations in the bathroom between classes. Some girls said Mrs. Garrett was just doing her job and we were making drama out of nothing. Others said they'd been waiting years for someone to speak up. A junior I didn't know stopped me in the hallway and thanked me. She said Mrs. Garrett had given her 3 violations last year and she'd been terrified of getting suspended. Now she felt like she could breathe. But a senior from my English class rolled her eyes when she saw me. She told her friend loud enough for me to hear that some people loved playing victim for attention. I kept my head down and focused on getting through each class period. 3rd period, the intercom crackled. and the new interim principal's voice filled the building. Joaquin Murillo had been brought in from another district. All students needed to report to the auditorium immediately for a mandatory assembly. We filed in grade by grade. Joaquin stood on stage looking calm and serious. He was younger than Mrs. Garrett, maybe 40, with graying hair and glasses. He didn't waste time with small talk. The photo submission app was discontinued effective immediately. The violation sweatsuits were being destroyed. Any student currently serving suspension for dress code violations would have those marks removed from their records. The auditorium exploded in applause and cheering. Some students whistled. Others hugged each other. I sat frozen in my seat. Maya grabbed my hand and squeezed. Joaquin waited for the noise to die down before continuing. He explained that a committee would form to create a new dress code policy. Students, parents, and teachers working together. The new policy would focus on health and safety, not policing bodies or preventing distraction. No more ruler measurements. No more photographing students. No more public shaming. The committee would meet weekly starting next Monday, and any student could volunteer to participate. More applause, though not as loud this time. I noticed several teachers in the back rows looking uncomfortable. One older teacher crossed her arms and frowned. Another whispered to the person next to her. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Joaquin finished by saying his door was always open, and students should feel safe bringing concerns directly to him. The assembly ended, and we filed back to our classes. Between 4th and 5th period, I ducked into the bathroom to check my pump. Kiana was standing at the sink washing her hands. We made eye contact in the mirror and both froze. I recognized her from the parent meeting, the girl whose photo made her mother sob. She recognized me too. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before she spoke. She said she'd developed anxiety around getting dressed every morning. She'd spend hours trying on different outfits, checking every angle in the mirror, measuring hem lengths and strap widths. Her parents thought she was just being difficult about clothes. They didn't understand she was trying to survive. Even now, with Mrs. Garrett gone, she still felt that panic when choosing what to wear. I told her I'd worn hoodies for 2 years straight, even in summer heat. She nodded like she understood completely. We stood there in that bathroom sharing something we couldn't quite name. Not friendship yet, but recognition. We weren't alone anymore. The next day, I carried my lunch tray through the cafeteria and found Kiana sitting alone at a corner table. She looked up when I approached and nodded at the empty seat across from her. I sat down without saying anything, and we ate in silence for a few minutes, just existing in the same space without needing to explain ourselves. Maya joined us halfway through lunch period, sliding into the seat next to me and asking if this was our table now. Kiana said she guessed it was. By the end of the week, 3 more girls from the folder had joined us. We didn't talk about what happened at first, just traded normal complaints about homework and teachers and weekend plans. But sitting together felt different from sitting alone, like we were building something without naming it yet. Rachel showed up the following Monday with her lunch bag and asked if she could sit with us. She was quiet for the first few days, mostly listening while the rest of us talked. Then one afternoon, she mentioned she'd been in treatment for an eating disorder for over a year. Her therapist kept asking what triggered it, trying to trace it back to some specific event or trauma. Rachel said she never connected it to the dress code stuff until she saw the folder documentation. Mrs. Garrett had written notes about her body type, calling her curvy and saying she needed to be more careful about what clothes she wore because her figure was naturally distracting. Rachel was 13 when those notes were written. She started skipping meals that same year, trying to make her body smaller and less noticeable. The treatment helped her stop the dangerous behaviors, but she'd never understood where the shame came from until she saw those words in the folder. Waverly joined our table the next week and shared her own story without us even asking. She'd been wearing leggings without a skirt last year during her period because the skirt she owned was in the wash. She asked to use the bathroom during 3rd period when she felt the cramps starting, but Mrs. Garrett denied the request and told her to wait until lunch. By 4th period, Waverly had bled through her clothes, and when she tried to leave class to handle it, Mrs. Garrett intercepted her in the hallway. She got sent home in a violation sweatsuit and then suspended for 3 days for the dress code violation and for leaving class without permission. The suspension note sent to her parents said she'd deliberately violated dress code during a feminine hygiene situation, like she'd planned the whole thing. As we shared stories over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that was worse than just strict dress code enforcement. Mrs. Garrett specifically targeted girls going through puberty, girls whose bodies were changing in ways they couldn't control. She went after girls from families without much money, who couldn't afford to replace uniforms every time they grew. She singled out girls who didn't fit her narrow idea of how teenage girls should look and act. Maya's soccer shirt incident wasn't about the shirt at all, but about Maya's short hair and athletic build. Kiana's uniform skirt problem wasn't about the length, but about her developing body making the same skirt look different. My insulin pump became a dress code issue because Mrs. Garrett saw any medical device as a challenge to her authority. The worst part we discovered came from looking at the folder timeline more carefully. Mrs. Garrett had been principal for 8 years total, but the Problem Girls folder only went back 3 years. That meant there were probably dozens more victims from before she started documenting everything. Girls who graduated never knowing others went through the same targeting. Girls who thought they were the only ones Mrs. Garrett singled out. Girls who blamed themselves for not being good enough or careful enough or small enough. We'd never know how many there really were. 2 weeks after our lunch group formed, Natalia scheduled a meeting with all 17 families to discuss lawsuit strategy. We gathered in a conference room at her office downtown on a Saturday morning. Natalia explained we could pursue civil rights violations for sex discrimination and disability discrimination in my case. We could also file personal injury claims. My medical emergency served as evidence of how dangerous Mrs. Garrett's policies became when taken to their extreme. The room filled with parents asking questions about timelines and costs and what we'd have to prove. Some families wanted to settle quickly and move on with their lives. They'd been through enough already and didn't want to drag it out through years of legal proceedings. Other families wanted a public trial to expose exactly what happened. They wanted Mrs. Garrett's actions documented in court records where future employers and schools would see them. I sat between Mom and Maya's parents feeling torn about what I wanted. Part of me wanted justice and accountability and public acknowledgement of what Mrs. Garrett did to all of us. But another part of me just wanted to forget this ever happened, so I could focus on college applications and moving forward with my life. I didn't know which feeling was right, or if both could be true at the same time. The meeting ended without any decisions made. Natalia said we had time to think about it and discuss it with our families. 3 days later, she called to tell us the district attorney Roy Coleman wanted to talk about potential criminal charges against Mrs. Garrett for child endangerment and official misconduct. My case specifically could support criminal prosecution because Mrs. Garrett deliberately prevented me from getting medical care while documenting that my pump alarms were going off. Roy explained in a follow-up phone call that proving criminal intent was difficult, but Mrs. Garrett's own notes might demonstrate willful disregard for my safety. She'd written down the times my alarms went off, noted that I asked to see the nurse, recorded her decision to keep me in her office anyway. That documentation could prove she knew I needed medical help and chose to deny it. But I would have to testify about the incident in detail. I'd have to sit in a courtroom and describe those 20 minutes watching my blood sugar climb while Mrs. Garrett typed her violation report. I started having panic attacks just thinking about it. I'd be in class or at lunch and suddenly my heart would start racing and I couldn't breathe. My hands would shake and I'd feel dizzy like I was back in that office again. The school counselor Dinesh reached out after my third panic attack sent me to the nurse's office. He taught me breathing exercises that sometimes helped when I felt one coming on. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, hold for 4. Focus on the counting instead of the memory. Ground myself in the present moment instead of that past trauma. The exercises worked maybe half the time, but half was better than nothing. Mom came home the next week with news that she'd talked to her supervisor about switching to part-time shifts. She'd work 3 days a week instead of 5, which meant less money, but more time at home with me. I felt guilty immediately because I knew how much we needed her income for rent and groceries and my medical supplies. She told me nothing mattered more than making sure I was okay, but I could see the worry in her face when she looked at our bills. I started checking online for part-time jobs I could handle around school and doctor appointments, anything to help cover the gap my medical crisis created. 2 days after Mom's schedule change, Blake called another meeting at the district office to share what the IT specialist found. All 17 families gathered again in that same conference room, and this time Blake looked even more uncomfortable than before. The IT specialist had recovered deleted emails from Mrs. Garrett's computer, showing she'd received complaints from at least 8 different parents and 4 teachers over the past 2 years. Every single complaint mentioned discriminatory enforcement or concerns about targeting specific students. Mrs. Garrett had responded to each one with dismissive language about coddling and lowering standards. One parent had written 3 separate emails asking why her daughter kept getting violations while boys wore identical clothing without consequences. Mrs. Garrett replied that the parent was teaching her daughter to blame others instead of taking responsibility. Another email from a teacher questioned why students from low-income families seemed to get more violations than others. Mrs. Garrett accused that teacher of reverse discrimination and threatened to file a complaint with the union. The pattern was clear and documented. Blake distributed copies of the recovered emails to all the families, and I watched parents' faces turn red as they read through Mrs. Garrett's responses. Maya's dad stood up and asked why nobody in the administration had noticed these complaints piling up. Blake admitted they'd failed to implement proper oversight of principals' disciplinary decisions. After Blake finished presenting the emails, he opened the floor for questions, and several teachers who'd come to the meeting stood up to speak. One teacher admitted she'd witnessed Mrs. Garrett measuring a student's skirt in the hallway and making comments about the girl's body that made everyone uncomfortable. She hadn't reported it because Mrs. Garrett had already transferred another teacher to a different school for questioning her policies. That transferred teacher had advocated for a student who couldn't afford new uniforms after a growth spurt, and Mrs. Garrett accused her of undermining authority. The teacher got reassigned to an elementary school across town within a month. Another teacher described seeing Mrs. Garrett photograph students without their consent and being told it was for documentation purposes. A third teacher mentioned that staff members learned quickly not to question Mrs. Garrett's decisions if they wanted to keep their preferred classroom assignments and schedule. The culture of fear extended beyond just students. Jasper stood up after the teachers finished speaking and gave a public apology that felt both necessary and insufficient. He acknowledged that the school board had failed to provide proper oversight that could have stopped Mrs. Garrett years earlier. He announced new policy changes requiring quarterly review of disciplinary patterns to identify potential discrimination. Any complaint about an administrator would now be automatically reported to the superintendent and board president. Teachers would have protection from retaliation if they reported concerning behavior. The policies sounded good, but I couldn't stop thinking about how they came too late for me and 16 other girls. A week after the meeting, Chelsea's article appeared in the community newspaper with the headline about systematic targeting at our high school. She didn't use our names but described the folder contents in detail and explained the pattern of enforcement that focused on girls' bodies while ignoring boys' clothing. She interviewed Dr. Salos about the medical emergency and included quotes from the hospital doctor about how close I'd come to permanent damage. The article detailed Mrs. Garrett's deleted emails and the teacher's admissions about the culture of fear. Chelsea wrote about how the photo submission app and public shaming sweatsuits created an environment where girls learned to make themselves small and invisible. The article spread through our community fast and generated intense debate. I made the mistake of reading the online comments section where some people defended Mrs. Garrett as a principled educator trying to maintain standards in a world that had gotten too permissive. They argued that dress codes existed for good reasons and students needed to learn to follow rules. Other commenters expressed outrage about the documented targeting and called for criminal charges beyond just firing. The comments got nastier as people argued back and forth about whether Mrs. Garrett was a monster or a scapegoat. I stopped reading after someone suggested I'd faked my medical emergency for attention. My college applications were due in 3 weeks, and I couldn't focus on the essays at all. Every prompt seemed designed to make me write about the dress code incident. Describe a challenge you've overcome. Discuss a moment that defined you. Explain how you've demonstrated resilience. How was I supposed to write about almost dying from a dress code violation without sounding like I was exploiting trauma for admission sympathy? I started and deleted a dozen different essays, none of them feeling right. Writing about it felt like reducing the worst experience of my life to a college admission strategy. Not writing about it felt like pretending it didn't happen and didn't matter. Dr. Salos called Mom to offer writing a recommendation letter for my applications. She wanted to focus on my medical self-advocacy and resilience in managing a chronic condition under impossible circumstances. She framed the incident as evidence of my maturity and ability to handle crises, which helped me see it differently than just trauma to overcome. Her letter would come from someone with serious medical credentials who'd witnessed everything firsthand. That perspective might help admissions officers understand the situation without me having to explain it myself. The 17 of us from the folder created a group chat to support each other through the legal process and recovery. Kiana started it and invited everyone, and within an hour we had all joined. We shared resources about trauma therapy and tips for managing anxiety at the school. Rachel posted breathing exercises similar to what Dinesh taught me. Waverly shared contact information for a therapist who specialized in institutional abuse. We reminded each other constantly that what happened wasn't our fault, that we didn't deserve the targeting, that surviving made us strong even when we didn't feel strong. The group chat became a place where we could talk about the hard stuff without explaining or justifying ourselves. Natalia filed the civil lawsuit 3 weeks after Mrs. Garrett's firing. The complaint alleged sex discrimination and disability discrimination in my case specifically. It described how Mrs. Garrett created a hostile educational environment that interfered with our ability to learn. The filing became public record immediately, and Chelsea wrote a follow-up article with more details about the legal claims. The lawsuit named both Mrs. Garrett personally and the school district for failing to stop her discriminatory enforcement despite documented complaints. Reading the legal language made everything feel more real and more terrifying at the same time. 2 weeks after Natalia filed the lawsuit, Mrs. Garrett's lawyer held a press conference outside the courthouse. I watched the video on my phone during lunch, sitting at our usual table with the other girls from the folder. The lawyer stood at a podium wearing an expensive suit, reading from a prepared statement about how Mrs. Garrett was a dedicated educator who spent 30 years serving students and families. She claimed the dress code policies were approved by the school board and designed to create a professional learning environment. Any harm that occurred was deeply regretted but completely unintentional, the lawyer said, and Mrs. Garrett looked forward to clearing her name through the legal process. The lawyer talked about my medical emergency like it was some unfortunate accident, like Mrs. Garrett hadn't blocked the door while my blood sugar hit 510. I threw my phone across the table and Kiana caught it before it hit the floor. The anger felt different from anything I'd experienced before, hot and sharp and impossible to ignore. Mrs. Garrett got to stand behind expensive lawyers and PR teams, rewriting what happened into something that sounded almost reasonable if you hadn't been there. She got to claim dedication and good intentions, while I was still having nightmares about dying in her office chair. Rachel squeezed my hand under the table, but didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would make the statement less infuriating. The lawyer's words kept replaying in my head all afternoon, the careful language that erased Mrs. Garrett's deliberate choices and turned 17 documented victims into an unfortunate misunderstanding. That night I couldn't sleep. So I sat at my desk refreshing news sites to read comments from people who believed Mrs. Garrett's version, who thought we were making a big deal out of normal school discipline. Some comments said teenagers always exaggerate and play victim when they face consequences for breaking rules. Others argued that dress codes existed for good reasons and students needed to learn respect for authority. A few people even suggested I faked the medical emergency for attention or to get out of trouble, despite the ICU records and Dr. Salos's testimony. I closed my laptop at 2 a.m. and checked my blood sugar 3 times even though my pump was working fine, unable to stop the anxiety that came from reading strangers dismiss what almost killed me. Roy called Mom the next morning to schedule a meeting at his office downtown. We drove there after school, parking in a garage that charged $8 an hour, and took an elevator to the 9th floor where the district attorney's office occupied half the building. Roy met us in the lobby, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, who shook our hands and led us to a small conference room. He spread files across the table, medical records and school documents and photos from Mrs. Garrett's computer, building his case like assembling puzzle pieces. Roy explained he'd decided to pursue criminal charges for child endangerment and official misconduct based on my specific situation. The trial would be difficult because proving criminal intent required showing Mrs. Garrett knew she was causing harm and did it anyway, not just that she made a mistake. But the evidence in my case was unusually strong, Roy said, because Mrs. Garrett had documented everything herself. Her violation report showed timestamps for when my pump alarms went off, proving she heard them and continued filling out paperwork instead of getting me medical help. The photos she took showed my insulin pump clearly visible, so she couldn't claim she didn't know it was a medical device. Her emails to other parents calling my emergency fake demonstrated she understood the severity and chose to dismiss it. Roy pulled out a printed copy of Mrs. Garrett's notes from that day, and I could see her handwriting describing my defiant behavior and manipulation tactics, while my blood sugar climbed past 450. He explained that blocking the door when I tried to leave for the nurse could support charges of false imprisonment in addition to endangerment. The case wasn't guaranteed, Roy admitted, because defense lawyers would argue Mrs. Garrett believed she was enforcing legitimate school policies and didn't intend to cause medical harm. But juries didn't like seeing children nearly die because an adult refused to call for help, especially when that adult documented the whole thing. Mom asked how long a trial would take, and Roy said probably 6 to 8 months from charges to verdict, maybe longer if there were delays. I would have to testify about what happened in detail, and the defense would cross-examine me trying to poke holes in my story. Roy looked at me directly and asked if I was prepared for that kind of scrutiny, for having my medical emergency questioned and picked apart in front of strangers. I told him I didn't know if I was prepared, but I wanted Mrs. Garrett to face real consequences beyond just losing her job. We left his office an hour later with paperwork about the criminal case and a court date scheduled for preliminary hearings in 6 weeks. Natalia called the following week to schedule my deposition for the civil lawsuit. She explained that depositions were like practice testimony, where the other side's lawyers could ask questions under oath, and everything I said would be recorded and could be used at trial. We met at her office 3 times before the actual deposition, so she could prepare me for the kinds of questions Mrs. Garrett's lawyer would ask. Natalia had me walk through the entire day from waking up that morning through being released from the ICU, over and over until I could recite the timeline without breaking down crying. She warned me the defense lawyer would try to make me seem overdramatic, or suggest I could have prevented the emergency somehow. The key was to stay calm, answer only what was asked, and not let them twist my words into something I didn't mean. The deposition happened in a conference room at a law office downtown, with a court reporter typing everything and cameras recording from 2 angles. Mrs. Garrett sat across the table from me with her lawyer, and I had to look at her face for the first time since she'd blocked her office door while I was dying. She looked older and tired, wearing a conservative dress and no makeup, clearly styled to appear sympathetic. Her lawyer started with basic questions about my medical history and diabetes management, establishing that I'd been successfully managing my condition for years. Then he moved into questions about that specific day, asking me to describe every detail from when I first noticed the pump malfunction. I walked through finding the kinked tube, my rising blood sugar, trying to find a private place to change the infusion site. The lawyer asked why I didn't go to the nurse's office immediately, and I explained about the line of dress code violators and needing to fix the problem right away before my blood sugar got dangerously high. He asked if I'd told Mrs. Garrett I was having a medical emergency, and I said yes, multiple times, while my pump alarm was screaming. The lawyer paused the recording and had the court reporter read back my earlier testimony about my blood sugar levels, then asked if I was certain those numbers were accurate, or if I might be misremembering due to the stress of the situation. Natalia objected immediately, pointing out that my continuous glucose monitor recorded everything automatically, and the hospital had the data. Mrs. Garrett's lawyer moved on to asking why I didn't speak more forcefully, or insist more loudly that I needed help. I stared at him and said I told Mrs. Garrett I was going into DKA and needed medical attention, and she responded by threatening to add assault charges if I tried to leave. He suggested maybe I hadn't adequately communicated the severity, that perhaps Mrs. Garrett didn't understand how serious the situation was. Natalia objected again, saying the question assumed facts not in evidence, and I realized this was exactly what testifying at trial would be like. The lawyer would take the worst moment of my life and pick it apart, suggesting I was being dramatic or didn't try hard enough or somehow brought this on myself. We broke for lunch after 3 hours, and I threw up in the bathroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn on the faucet. Natalia found me there and helped me clean up, telling me I was doing great, and we were almost done. The afternoon session lasted another 2 hours, covering my hospitalization and recovery, and by the end I was so exhausted I could barely form complete sentences. Mom drove me home, and I slept for 14 hours straight, waking up with a headache and the feeling that I'd been hit by a truck. The school district's settlement offer arrived 2 weeks later in a thick envelope delivered to all 17 families simultaneously. Natalia called to walk us through the terms before we opened it. The district was offering to cover all therapy costs related to the dress code targeting, compensate families for documented harm including medical bills and emotional distress, and commit to specific policy reforms with third-party monitoring. The financial amounts varied based on individual circumstances, with my family's offer being one of the highest because of the hospitalization and near-death experience. But accepting the settlement required signing a non-disclosure agreement about the specific dollar amounts and some details of what happened, though we could still talk generally about the dress code policies and their impact. The NDA felt like the district trying to hide what they'd done, paying us to stay quiet about the worst parts. But the money was real and substantial, enough to cover years of therapy and help Mom reduce her work hours without financial stress. Natalia emphasized this was a personal decision each family had to make based on their own circumstances and priorities, and there was no right answer. Our group chat exploded within an hour of everyone receiving their offers. Kiana posted first saying her family desperately needed the money and couldn't afford to drag out a trial for another year. Her parents had already spent thousands on therapy, and her dad had missed work to attend meetings with lawyers and school administrators. Waverly responded that she understood the financial pressure, but felt like the NDA protected the district from full accountability, letting them pay their way out of consequences without admitting what they did was wrong. Rachel pointed out that accepting settlement didn't mean Mrs. Garrett avoided consequences since the criminal case was separate. Several parents chimed in with different perspectives, some focused on their daughter's well-being and wanting to move forward, others angry about the NDA terms and feeling like the district was buying silence. I read through dozens of messages, understanding both sides and feeling torn about what we should do. The money would change our lives in concrete ways, but signing an NDA felt like agreeing to protect the institution that enabled Mrs. Garrett's abuse for years. Mom and I sat at the kitchen table that night with the settlement documents spread between us, talking through every angle for hours. She asked what I wanted to do, and I said I didn't know, that I hated the idea of an NDA, but also recognized how much the money would help us. Mom reminded me that Chelsea's articles had already created public awareness, that the policy changes were happening regardless of our settlement decision, and that the 5 families choosing to continue to trial would keep the pressure on the district. She pointed out that financial security would give me freedom to focus on recovery and college without worrying about therapy costs or her working herself into exhaustion. But she also said she'd support whatever I decided because I was the one who almost died, and my voice mattered most in this choice. We talked about principle versus pragmatism, about public accountability versus private healing, about whether accepting money meant letting the district off easy. I called Rachel around midnight, needing to hear from someone else who was making the same decision. She'd already decided to accept the settlement after talking with her therapist. Rachel said the policy changes, and Chelsea's journalism already created the public awareness we'd wanted, and the settlement money would pay for treatment for her eating disorder without bankrupting her family. She reminded me that we'd already changed things by speaking up, that other students were safer now because of what we'd exposed, and that taking care of ourselves wasn't the same as letting the district escape responsibility. Her perspective helped me see the settlement differently, not as silence but as securing resources we needed to heal, while the criminal case and remaining civil trial kept the pressure on. I told Mom the next morning that I wanted to accept the settlement. The money would cover my therapy and let her return to full-time work without the financial stress that had defined our lives for years. It wasn't perfect, and the NDA still bothered me. But Rachel was right that we'd already created public change, and this decision was about taking care of ourselves now. 12 of the 17 families accepted the settlement over the next 2 weeks. Natalia helped us finalize the agreements, reviewing every clause and making sure we understood exactly what we were signing. The 5 families who chose to continue to trial had different circumstances, some with lawyers working for free, others with financial resources to sustain a long legal battle, all of them prioritizing public accountability over settlement money. Our group chat shifted from debate to support, with those of us accepting the settlement, encouraging the 5 families continuing and promising to help however we could. Kiana posted that we were all making the right choices for our individual situations, and nobody should feel guilty about their decision. Natalia continued representing the 5 families while helping the rest of us complete our settlement paperwork, navigating the strange situation of being both our lawyer and theirs with different strategies. I signed the final documents in Natalia's office 3 weeks after receiving the offer, my hand cramping from writing my name so many times across different pages. The settlement money would arrive in 60 days, deposited into an account Mom set up specifically for my therapy and medical expenses. I felt relieved and guilty simultaneously, glad to have resources for healing, but aware that 5 families were still fighting the battle I'd chosen to step back from. Roy called a few days after I signed the settlement to explain that the criminal trial against Mrs. Garrett was moving forward regardless of our civil settlement decisions. He said criminal cases belong to the state, not individual victims, so my settlement didn't affect the prosecution at all. The district attorney's office was pursuing charges based on what Mrs. Garrett did, not based on whether victims wanted to continue civil lawsuits. I would still have to testify at the criminal trial about the medical emergency and Mrs. Garrett's refusal to help. Roy explained this was actually good news because it meant Mrs. Garrett faced real consequences beyond just paying money, that the state was holding her accountable for endangering a child regardless of any settlement agreements. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, where a judge would decide if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. Roy felt confident about the evidence but warned me that criminal trials took time and energy, that I'd be cross-examined again and have to relive that day in front of a jury. I told him I was ready to testify, that Mrs. Garrett needed to face criminal consequences for what she did. He said he'd be in touch as the hearing date approached and to take care of myself in the meantime. I hung up feeling like the settlement had been the right choice for my family's immediate needs, while the criminal case would provide the public accountability I'd wanted. Both things could be true at once, taking care of myself and seeking justice, and I didn't have to choose between them after all. The criminal trial started 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in late November. Roy met me outside the courthouse and walked me through what would happen, reminding me to answer only what was asked and stay calm no matter what the defense attorney said. I sat in the witness chair with my hands folded in my lap, trying not to shake while the prosecutor asked me to describe what happened that day in the science lab. I explained about my pump malfunction, my blood sugar climbing past 400, how I needed to change my infusion site immediately, or risk going into a coma. The defense attorney stood up when it was his turn and suggested I could have asked permission first, could have waited until after school, could have done anything besides lifting my shirt in front of school board members. Roy had prepared me for this, so I stayed calm and explained that at 425 blood sugar, I had maybe an hour before serious organ damage, that waiting wasn't medically possible, that I tried to explain this to Mrs. Garrett, but she refused to listen. The attorney asked why I didn't just leave her office and go to the nurse anyway, and I described how she physically blocked the door and threatened to add assault charges if I tried to push past her. He asked if I was exaggerating the medical emergency for sympathy, and I pulled up my hospital records on my phone showing 3 days in ICU with organ stress markers. The jury looked uncomfortable during his questions, but I kept my voice steady and stuck to exactly what happened without adding emotion or drama. Dr. Salos testified the next day as an expert witness about diabetic ketoacidosis and how the delay in my treatment could have killed me. She explained in clear terms that a blood sugar of 510 meant my blood was turning acidic, that my organs were starting to shut down, that another 30 minutes could have meant permanent brain damage or death. She described watching Mrs. Garrett take photos of me trying to change my pump site while my monitor was alarming, watching her dismiss my medical emergency as manipulation, watching her physically prevent me from accessing care. Her medical authority made everything feel more real somehow, hearing a doctor explain that what happened to me wasn't just scary, but actually life-threatening. I watched several jury members lean forward during her testimony, their faces showing horror when she described the physical process of ketoacidosis and what my body was experiencing during those 20 minutes in Mrs. Garrett's office. The defense attorney tried to suggest Dr. Salos was biased because she'd been involved in getting Mrs. Garrett fired, but she calmly explained that her medical opinion was based on objective evidence and her expertise treating hundreds of diabetic patients over 20 years. The jury went out to think about their decision just after lunch, and we waited in a small room down the hall for 6 hours while they talked through everything. Roy said 6 hours meant they were taking it seriously, that quick verdicts usually meant not guilty, because prosecutors have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Mom brought sandwiches from the cafeteria, but I couldn't eat, just sat there checking my blood sugar every 30 minutes out of habit and anxiety. Finally, around 7 p.m., the bailiff came to get us, and we filed back into the courtroom to hear the verdict. The jury foreman stood up and said they found Mrs. Garrett guilty of child endangerment and official misconduct, and I felt Mom grab my hand so tight it hurt. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and when that day came, he gave Mrs. Garrett 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and permanent taking away of her teaching license. She would never work in education again, could never have authority over students, could never put another kid in danger the way she put me in danger. Sitting in the courtroom listening to the sentence, I felt two opposite things at the same time. Part of me thought 2 years probation seemed like nothing compared to almost dying, compared to 3 days unconscious in a hospital bed, compared to the nightmares I still had about being trapped in her office watching my blood sugar climb. But another part of me felt satisfied knowing she could never teach again, that the state had officially said what she did was criminal. that her license was gone forever, so no future student would ever be in danger from her. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something real, something that mattered, something that said what happened to me was serious and wrong and had consequences. Back at the school, Joaquin called an assembly in early December to announce the new dress code policy created by the committee of students, parents, and teachers who'd been working on it for months. He stood at the podium with a printed copy and explained that the new policy focused on basic safety stuff, like closed-toe shoes in science labs and nothing that could hurt someone in PE class. All the old language about distraction and specific measurements was gone, all the rules about shoulder width and fingertip length, and whether leggings needed skirts over them. The policy said students should dress in a way that let them learn comfortably and safely, and that was basically it. Some students clapped and others looked confused, like they couldn't believe we were actually being trusted to dress ourselves without someone measuring our bodies with a ruler. The new policy also said that taking photos of students for dress code reasons was completely banned, that no staff member could photograph a student's outfit or body for any disciplinary purpose. If someone's clothes were actually unsafe, like flip-flops in a chemistry lab, they could borrow school shoes or clothes without any shame or paperwork or violation notices. No more gray sweatsuits with dress code violation printed on them. No more public humiliation. No more suspensions that went on college applications. Joaquin explained that the committee wanted to focus on education instead of policing bodies, on safety instead of control, on respect instead of shame. Senior year kept going after that, and I slowly started feeling safer at the school, though I still got anxious around authority figures and had panic moments during medical stuff. Therapy helped me work through the fear without letting it control my whole life, helped me separate what happened from what might happen, helped me prepare for college and moving forward. I stopped wearing baggy hoodies all the time and started dressing normally again, stopped hiding my insulin pump under layers of fabric, stopped checking group chats for Mrs. Garrett's location, even though she was gone. The trauma didn't disappear, but it got smaller, got more manageable, became something I was dealing with instead of something that defined every minute of every day. College acceptance letters started arriving in March, and I got into several schools with good financial aid packages that would cover most of my costs. Dr. Salos's recommendation letter apparently made a strong impression because 2 schools specifically mentioned her comments about my medical self-advocacy in their acceptance notes. I chose a state school 3 hours away with a strong disability services program and good support for students with ongoing health conditions. They had a whole office dedicated to helping students with diabetes, asthma, and other stuff that needed daily management, plus counseling services and peer support groups. It felt like a place where I could be safe and still be independent, where having a medical device wouldn't make me different or suspicious or targeted. The 5 families who'd continued with their civil trial instead of accepting the settlement won their case in April. The school district was ordered to pay significant money in damages and implement additional watching measures to prevent future abuse by administrators. Chelsea wrote a final article for the community newspaper documenting the complete timeline from my hospitalization through both trials, through the policy changes, and the accountability measures and the institutional reforms. Her article made it clear that what happened wasn't just one bad principal, but a system that let her get away with it for years, that real change required more than just firing one person. Our group of 17 stayed in touch through the rest of senior year and into summer, planning to keep connected as we headed off to college or work or whatever came next. We created something meaningful from shared trauma, supported each other through recovery and legal proceedings and healing, made sure that what happened to us led to real change that would protect future students. The group chat stayed active with people sharing their plans and fears and hopes, checking in when someone had a bad day, celebrating victories like college acceptances or therapy breakthroughs, or just making it through a week without nightmares. We weren't just victims anymore. We were people who'd survived something terrible together, and used that experience to make things better. Graduation day arrived in June, and Mom took the whole day off work to be there, sitting in the bleachers with her camera ready. I wore my cap and gown over a sundress with my insulin pump clipped to my waistband, visible for anyone who looked. When they called my name, I stood up and thought about sitting in Mrs. Garrett's office watching my blood sugar climb past 500, about waking up in the ICU with tubes in my arms, about how close I came to not making it to this moment. I walked across the stage and shook hands with Joaquin and accepted my diploma, and Mom was crying in the audience, but they were good tears this time. The summer passed quickly with college preparation and saying goodbye to the group chat friends who were heading to different schools, promising to stay in touch and check in on each other. I started college in August at the state school 3 hours away, moving into the dorms with my medical supplies and my insulin pump clipped openly to my jeans. No more baggy hoodies hiding my device. No more checking group chats for administrator locations. No more fear that keeping myself alive would get me punished. Other students asked about my pump sometimes, and I explained it simply. No shame or anxiety, just facts about managing diabetes. The dress code nightmare taught me something important that I carried forward into this new chapter. Surviving what happened wasn't enough on its own. Speaking up when something is wrong, demanding better treatment, making noise until people listen, That's how we protect ourselves and everyone who comes after us. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore about things that mattered. Wasn't going to make myself small to avoid trouble. Wasn't going to let fear stop me from taking up space and asking for what I needed to stay healthy and safe.